Good evening and welcome to our fifth installment in our series User Manual for Humans. So tonight we'll have another good talk. We're going to get some good material covered. And a lot of times people don't really understand what health is about or why it matters, or they feel fine, they're still young, they still don't have any major diseases. But we're going to talk about blood sugar and diabetes. And this is one of the most important, one of the most prevalent conditions we've ever seen, and it's epidemic, it's exploding. We'll give you some statistics toward the end to scare you some. And if you're taking good care of yourself, then I'm sure that you know someone who doesn't, who needs to know this information. So take good notes and pass this on. We will talk about the purpose of blood sugar. What is it for? What does it do in the body? What sort of balance do we need to maintain? The process of absorption, because that's crucial in determining the level of blood sugar. What are the hormonal effects? And that's primarily insulin we'll talk about. What is insulin resistance? Because most people know that that's a bad thing and that it could lead to diabetes, but how does it all work? And then we'll talk about diabetes, which today affects 8.3% of the US population that are full-fledged diabetics. And there's many times that number of people that are pre-diabetic. One of my favorite quotes: what gets us in trouble is not what we don't know, it's what we know for sure that just ain't so. That's Mark Twain. And there are so many things that we're going to cover in these series that are well-established facts that the establishment, the people who know, say this is the way it is, and yet we find out a few years later, or the people on the cutting edge know that it just ain't so. For one thing, since we're talking about diabetes, the food pyramid says that we should eat 8 to 11 servings of grains every day. Well, that's an excellent recipe to get diabetes. If you're not in the risk zone, just follow the food pyramid, and before you know it, you'll be there. Let's talk a little bit about why we end up in this position. First of all, why do sweets taste so good? I think that's the biggest problem for a lot of people. And we have to think back and look at survival advantage. And back many thousands of years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of sweets. So the taste of sweet helped humans to select the foods that gave quick energy. So back then, it was basically fruits and an occasional beehive that you ran across. Those were the sweets that we had. And the more that you could quickly get energy into the body, the better your chances of survival. And if there was abundant food, then wherever you could find sweet and rich food, you could pack on some fat, and that would help you survive later in times of starvation. So that's why we have that mechanism in the first place. And it never became a problem until we started processing food and extracting the source of the sweet flavor, the sugar, out of the natural food and processing it so it became widely abundant, and we can have it as syrup and Coca-Cola and candy. And now it's a completely different animal. They've estimated that back in the day when they were hunter-gatherers, that if they ran across an occasional beehive, that was the only refined sugar that they would ever come across. And just kind of guesstimating, they assumed that if you find 4 pounds of honey per year, per person, you're still pretty lucky. But that would amount to about 1 teaspoon per day. So essentially, for the period of time that your DNA has developed, you've been exposed to about 1 teaspoon a day. So that's the amount of sugar that you're fine with. Anything else is a little bit of a burden on the body. Back in the day, there was no such thing as bread, pastries, waffles, pasta, syrup, pancakes, candy, cookies, chocolate, pasta, and so on and so on and so on. These items did not exist. They just weren't in existence. So because of that, your DNA has never encountered those foods. Your body can deal very well with short-term starvation, but it has no defense against chronic abundance of processed foods. Historical adaptation, again, we've mentioned this a little bit before, but the DNA of Homo sapiens has not changed significantly in about 40,000 years. We've been hunter-gatherers, we've come across the occasional beehive, we've eaten fruits and vegetables, we've hunted meat and game, and that's what our DNA recognizes, that's what we know what to do with. Then in the last 4,000 years, which is a blink of time in evolution in terms of changing DNA, we've introduced agriculture. So we had more than an occasional few grains, but there was still no processing at all. Then in the last few hundred years, we have had modest availability of processed sugar and processed grains. And 150 years in terms of, compared to 40,000, again, it's a blink. There's no time for the body to adapt. And in the last 50 years, we've had an abundance of sugar. In this country, I think it's roughly a half a pound of sugar per person per day. Okay? And I don't eat my half a pound, so someone's eating mine as well. That's astounding. That's 800 calories of sugar, refined sugar and syrup and corn syrup per day. So that is why, and then of course we add the starch and the white bread and the waffles to that, there's no wonder that there's an epidemic of diabetes. So let's talk a little bit about the process. What is blood sugar and what's the process of getting? So first, we eat the food and it's in our gut. Then it has to be digested, and just because we put something into the mouth doesn't mean that it is functional and available to the body. It has to pass across a number of membranes through a process of digestion and absorption, and then it gets into the bloodstream, and now it exists in the form of sugar as glucose molecules in the bloodstream. And it is still of absolutely no use to the body, because the only place we can use the sugar is inside of cells. So now we have to get it from the bloodstream and into the cell. And this doesn't happen by itself. There are gates and there are receptors on the cells to absorb, to take in the sugar, but these gates, they don't work without insulin. So that is what insulin is all about. That is the function of insulin, is that it activates the receptors so that we can get the sugar into the cell. You have a little receptor, the insulin attaches to it, and now that gate is open for the sugar. And this is important to realize, and the more processed the food is, the quicker it will get into the bloodstream and the faster your blood sugar will rise. We'll talk more about this. So weight gain is not about how many calories you eat. It is in a way, but not really, and here's why. When the sugar gets into the bloodstream, when the food gets into the bloodstream faster than we can use it and get it into the cells and burn it off, then the excess has to be stored. Okay? And we can only store about 800 calories worth, 200 grams or so worth of sugar and carbohydrates, and the rest of it has to be turned into fat. So fat develops when the food we eat gets into the bloodstream too fast. We have to get a lot of insulin to get it into the cell, and whatever the cell can't use at the time gets converted to fat. So it's not so much the amount of food